Yes, so here at the Museum of Modern Art, within the context of the contemporary and modern art perspective in a global age or CMAP initiative, I would like to address the time and space of the exhibition as related to contemporary Caribbean spatial practices, both artistic and curatorial. Much as I do not like to define myself in the negative, I shall say that I am neither a Caribbeanist nor an academic for that matter, and present myself to you here primarily as a practicing contemporary art curator interested in spatial practices. And so my presentation is very much in keeping with an earlier paper I delivered last year at Tilting Axis. It's a roving Caribbean discursive platform that's instrumental really in bringing the people of the Caribbean together to share discourses and practices. This year it took place in Santo Domingo, and Iberia had the pleasure to attend it. And my paper is also, so that paper already was very much looking at Caribbean spatial practices and trying to see if there was anything specific to aesthetic diasporic practices that could inform the way in which we curators in turn present their work in a public forum. And my presentation is also very much indebted, for genealogies are tremendously important as we know, to a set of colleagues, art historians, art critics, and an artist, among whom Krista Thompson, who was my collaborator for the exhibition En Masse, Carnival and Performance Art of the Caribbean, artist, art critic, mentor, Christopher Cozier of Alice Yard, and one of the earlier theorists of mass, masquerade, carnival, as per the Trinidadian colloquium, and also the artist, Trinidad-born, Japan-based Marlon Griffiths, and last but not least, Gia Wolf, not of the Caribbean, but doing research on Brazil and specifically on the urban dimension, temporary as it is, of Brazil, Rio's carnival. So these are my thinking partners in my work, and very much so for this presentation today. And so, of course, you know, this paper is in express response to the seminar's address on the topic of performing identities, self-fashioning in visual culture and architecture, with a focus, as the brief indicated, in forms of resistance to national narratives, countermodes of identity to community, diaspora, and nation, and tensions within between local art histories and national narratives, as well as, and maybe more importantly to me, diasporic frameworks of actualization. At a historical juncture in which displacement has become central to a global experience. But I will not so much speak about performing identities as much as I will look at the spaces where these identities can be performed. And lastly, about the conference brief, as a Black Atlantic framework of analysis has largely dismissed the valence of the notion of nation onto an African diasporic experience, I will not so much discuss consideration of nationhood, but focus instead on the formation of resistant spaces, of spatial infrastructures of fugitivity within African diasporic spatial practices, with a view to investigating their possible adaptability to global spaces of diasporization. And so a lot of the visuals are excerpted from past curatorial projects or specific artists. They're all hopefully adequately labeled so that you can refer back to their various authors as need be. In Measures of an Exhibition, architecture curator Carson Chan argues that space, not art, is the curator's primary material. To Chan, the current condition in exhibition making practice, according to which, quote, large-scale exhibitions have become emptied of their function as an effective survey of the latest artistic ideas. Digital communication has supplanted the large-scale exhibition in this role, and furthermore, the internet is becoming a site in which art is not only represented, but actualized and validated, unquote. So for him, this set of conditions presents for exhibition makers and curators both a need and an opportunity to reposition space rather than the artwork as the primary material in exhibition making. Indeed, according to Chan, if art can be apprehended, if not experienced, apart from materiality, the physical exhibition's raison d'être must be conceived of as an experience structured around the exigencies of tangible space. Applied to the context of African diaspora spatial practices, Chan's exhortation to exhibition makers to pay attention to the material reality and the physical condition of exhibition-making practices, endangered by both the dematerialization of the art object and the digitalization of the artistic experience, dovetails art historian Krista Thompson's insistent demand in How to Install Art as a Caribbeanist for the consideration of a Caribbeanist perspective in curating Caribbean art, informed by an appreciation of the particulars of African diasporic aesthetic practices. In this essay, Thompson elaborates from Helen Molesworth's like demand for a feminist perspective in How to Install Art as a Feminist. In it, Molesworth says, or rather advocates, to think through the translation of new feminist discursive formations into the spatial logic and requirements of the museum. Picking up where Ellen Molesworth leaves off, Thompson seeks to uncover, as related to the field of Caribbean art, what are some of the aesthetic practices and structures of visuality in the Caribbean region that influence Caribbean art, and how these structures of visualities may inform our understanding of and our curatorial approach to it. Sounds pretty basic, and yet. Forward. Both Chan and Thompson's formulations are differently instrumental in shedding light upon my concurrent, and not subsequent, decade-long elaboration of a Caribbean curatorial discourse and practice, or maybe more modestly and maybe more accurately, of the formation of a curatorial discourse and practice informed by a Caribbean historical frame of spatial references. Might this Caribbean spatial reference upon which to base curatorial coordinates be located in the traditional spaces of the backyard, or the mass camp, or the dance hall, spaces of vernacular modernism, in the words of Kingston-based cultural critic Annie Paul, herself quoting from Homi Bhabha's notion of vernacular modernism and Kabina Mercer's notion of cosmopolitan modernism? And if not these traditional spaces, where and how else? And this is the way in which this is a continuation of a set of questions that were posed at Tilting Axis last year in Grand Cayman, where the paper upon which I'm building this one today was within a panel titled The Spaces of the Exhibition, Traditional and Non-Traditional. And of course, within a Caribbeanist perspective, traditional spaces for exhibiting are of course not the museum, and instead it is rather a non-traditional space within which cultural practices occur. The traditional spaces would indeed be the backyard or the mass camp, i.e. the Carnival Warehouse, or of course the dance hall, for instance. What might be the third space in relationship to the Du Boisian characterization of the African diasporic experience through constant resistance to second sites? So what might be the third space for the second sites that continue to be constitutive of African diasporic subject formation in the way in which this set of conditions of an African diasporic subjectivity are repurposed by Krista Thompson in her call for an African diaspora art history? I trust that the latter reference to African diasporic racial othering and specular subjections to the tropes of white hegemonic visuality transposed to an art historical analysis provides sufficient evidence to the political imperative of carving out a third space for Caribbean aesthetic practices, just as the resurgence, or rather the increased media attention to the lethal violence inflicted upon Black bodies, has served as a catalyst for the movement for Black lives' urgent creation of safe spaces for people of African descent in the United States. And so, again, I wonder what are and how have the resistance spatial practices of the African diaspora formed, and how do they fare within the museum's exhibitionary complex? And here, to illustrate this point, I compare and contrast the same work by Marlon Griffiths, the Japan-based, Trinidad-born artist of which I spoke earlier, who, in the case of the slide in the upper left corner of the screen, led a performance at the dawn of Carnival in Trinidad back in 2014, entitled Position and Power. Of course, within the public space of the street, and then the way in which it was reconfigured by Krista and myself in an exhibition designed by G.R. Wolf, somehow following a kind of circumambulatory principle, and yet somehow deadening the various artifacts that had been presented otherwise in a live fashion. And it's important for me also to compare these Caribbeanist or these Caribbean aesthetic practices and the various curatorial modes through which they can be made available to a wider or maybe non-Caribbean audience within a museum context, to safe space formation by African American artists within the museum, well, within and without the museum's sanctum itself. And so I was very interested in the way in which artists from Colleen Smith to Simone Lee in recent exhibitions, be it the Whitney Biennial in the case of the former, or the new museum in the case of the latter, staged events in and out of the museum, trying to at once bring visibility but also deploy the agency of Black bodies. And so I believe that we have to shift, and I think that both my colleagues would agree, from the field of visuality to the field of performativity, or maybe rather to pay attention to both in combination in order to understand how the spatialization of resistance has historically taken place within African diaspora and Caribbean artistic practices specifically. And so I'm making a bit of a detour here to, yet again, the work of Marlon Griffiths in the way in which his production has been studied by Krista and put into motion by myself in my curatorial work. So his work, in my view, provides ample examples of forms of specializations of resistance in the dual valence of visuality and performativity. One of the few proponents of mass, i.e. The artistic dimension of Carnival, of his generation, he was born in 1976, Griffiths has refined techniques for observing the unseen and the invisible as a primary modus operandi. As have many other Caribbean artists, John Biddle, Hugh Locke are only but a few we could think of. And the way in which they have arrived at these forms of unseeing, for instance, cutout techniques reminiscent of the lacework customary to wooden and metallic decorative patterns in Caribbean colonial architecture, form a negative space that escapes prehension, just like the shadows created from light cast through them carve orifices, likewise evading tangible capture. But bring these visual techniques of spatial escape to bear upon Griffiths' hallmark processional performance work, here within the context of Junkanoo, which is the end of the year street masquerade that takes place, in Nassau. And you begin to gain fuller awareness of the fugitive effect motion conspires to produce for what I hope can begin to be considered as a unique Caribbean spatial ontology. I quote here Christopher Cozier. Exhibitions without walls and in the public domain advocate another way or mode of curatorship. Indeed, these are modes of curatorial practice that not only transform the more conventional spaces in which Caribbean art is displayed, but through a consideration of artistic practices historically, redefine the meaning of the art object and how it is experienced. They place an emphasis on the body as an art object, on the multisensorial movement of the object in three-dimensional space, on the performative as an ephemeral form of art production. And so, and these were a mix of both the words of Christopher Cozier and of Krista Thompson, and her use of both his words as one of the earlier critic of the form and of my curatorial work. And so the outcome of our decade-long artist/curator collaboration, and I refer to Marlon Griffiths here, the formation of processional performance as both an artistic and curatorial mode of display specific to Caribbean art does not only reactivate the memory of historical moments of actual resistance, but it also actualizes resistance spaces that are at the margin of the Western Museum complex and could be at the center of an African diasporic, Caribbean, and more widely, maybe a diasporic display complex. And so here I wanted to introduce you, some of those of you who are familiar with my work would be quite knowledgeable about these older works. This is indeed 10 years old. But I want to show you the way in which this particular mode of the processional, whether it refers to street masquerading practices or, of course, builds upon the various processional modes within protest marches, for instance, how, again, it has the power of both reactivating the memory of events that have occurred formerly, but also of actualizing contemporary resistant spaces. And so time and again in my curatorial work, I return to historical moments of resistance as the backdrop against which the processional performance I directed unfolded. And so here, 10 years ago, or almost, it was on September 5th, 2008, in Gwangju for the Gwangju Biennial, which this year was under the artistic directorship of Okuyan Wezor, I looked back at, and I will do a quick, I looked back at, sorry, and this is where I begin to mix my papers. I looked back at the May 18 Democratic Uprising of the 1980s, which is the single most event responsible for the democratization of South Korea, if you will, Tiananmen Square 9 years prior, with, of course, a different set of circumstances, and also the events which inspired Yong-Woo Lee to form the Gwangju Biennale Foundation as, in order to identify Gwangju as a beacon for democracy in South Korea. And so here, in addition to the very location where well, the event to which the performance referred and the location where it took place, as you can see, it is the very same square, or rather roundabout, around which the processional unfolded. But also both the artist Marlon Griffiths and myself, strong though we were and still are of our historical Caribbean consciousness, looked back at an important event in Trinidad, the Canboulay riots, which took place both in 1881 and 1884, and were essentially a protest during the Carnival for the continued existence of the Carnival against, of course, the wishes of the British colonial powers at the time. And so the Canboulay riots, as they were known, were instrumental really in establishing Carnival as a determinant for a free space for the formerly enslaved Trinidadian population of African descent, and later also for the Indian indentured laborers that took their place in plantation labor. This is thank you. This is further detailed of only of still I'm keeping up with Marlon's work, but there were many more artists, Caribbean and otherwise. But among the Caribbean artists, also Mario Benjamin and artist from Brazil, Jarbas Lopez, and Karen Olivier, who you know here as an artist living and working in the US, but who is originally from Trinidad and Tobago. Another example, A Walk into the Night, which I curated for Capo 9, the second and last edition of the Cape Town Biennial. And yet again, it built upon a significant moment within the history of South Africa in the dawn of the apartheid era, and this is the forced removals. And so the very title of the piece, A Walk in the Night, paid homage to a novel by Alex Laguma about the forced removals of colored population from the city center to the outskirts of town, with the consequence of forming what is now known as the townships, and really wreaking awoke the very multicultural communities that existed in the center of Cape Town, the population that were then, as they are now, known as colored. And so in addition to the historical reference to the forced removal and the symbolic resettlement of these transient carnival practices within the city center, the location yet again mattered. Indeed, this processional took place in the Company Gardens. So, of course, the history of slavery was also evoked. For the company of which the garden, which housed the garden, is the Dutch East India Company. So there again, there's any numbers of spatial memorial reference, if you will, which resonate strongly locally. And which otherwise, through the very motion of bodies in space, can confer upon a wider audience the general sense of migration, dispossession, and diaspora. That really, a formation of a group in motion tends to induce. And I think that is all I have to say for A Walk into the Night. Also that the very performers were members of the quote-unquote colored communities which host these various carnival practices, if you will, knowing that Carnival always has had, in Cape Town, an ambivalent history of racial accommodation at once and spatial resistance to white hegemonic power in the struggle for the public occupation of urban space. There's a lot just about that, but I will move on. A close-up again of these various transient forms, migrant bodies. And the last of these that I wanted to share with you took place at Tate Modern in the Turban Hall just about 4 years ago. And this particular project was called Uphill Down Hall. And yet again, through the punning title, Notting Hill Turban Hall, it is the history of the Notting Hill Carnival that I wanted to reference for, as those of you who are interested in Caribbean history globally may know, the Notting Hill Carnival was born in the late 1950s, early 1960s, as an act of, yet again, I would call it spatial resistance to the extermination of migrant or Caribbean migrants at the hands of their rivals who would not have recognized them necessarily as the former subjects of the queens that they always were. I always like to refer back to Stuart Hall. We are here because you were there. Well, in 1959, a horrendous murder of an Antiguan took place, Kelso Cochran, and it is that event that determined Claudia Jones, the Trinidadian founder of what became the Notting Hill Carnival, to respond by an act of cultural resistance through the celebratory means of Carnival. And in turn, it is another murder, likewise of a Briton of Caribbean descent, this time in 2011, Mark Duggan, event which sparks the London riots of that summer, that Marlon Griffiths conceived of his piece, No Black in the Union Jack, coincidentally referring to or alluding to Paul Gilroy's work of the same title. Here is actually another slide of another artist of Caribbean descent. That's Hugh Locke. And I want you to pay attention to the deconstructed canopy of rope, which united the upper and lower levels of the turban hall. For you will see other forms of canopies being used in Carnival in Trinidad. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is twofold, because again, in looking for other spatial references without resorting to what maybe Anomia would refer to as ethnocultural modes. Well, again, what are the sets of infrastructural devices that we can unfurl in context within which they are not native, if you will? So again, what are the principles, the organizing principles through which we can begin to conceive of other spaces? And so this is just something that I wanted to, for you to pay attention to, because you will see how it was adapted or translated into the context of the Turban Hall from works of the Trinidad Carnival that we will see next. And so, as I said, in addition to reactivating the memory of historical moments of resistance, I have hoped also through this work, this curatorial work, which really has as its primary intention, as always is the case of curatorial work, to serve the intentions of the artists themselves. I have hoped to also actualize resistance spaces that may be at the margin of the Western Museum complex. Moving on to another terrain, though, here for some theoretical stamina, I turn to Homi Bhabha, and building upon the work of the South African scholar Leora Malsleka in both their recent analysis of William Kentridge's work. In an essay which appeared recently in Art Forum, Homi Bhabha characterizes the footstep and by extension processional ethics as a symbol of the collective condition of dispossession and diaspora. And he asks, what kind of political movement is the procession? What is its footsteps? If Bhabha's characterization of Kentridge's procession of the dispossessed as epitomizing conditions of dispossession and diaspora has purchased onto Caribbean processional spatial practices of resistance, his experience of Kentridge's more sweetly plays the dance, here pictured in its iteration at Marian Goodman Gallery in London. His experience of more sweetly plays the dance as a refusal of time and place, or in other words, not the moment and not the direction, might not unanimously apply to what I conceive of as the heterochronotopic space of African diaspora, special practices of resistance through processional performance. And yet I do find it tremendously useful to apply this notion of processional ethics to an increasing body of work in this genre that seems to confirm the genre's much older, indeed millenary purchase onto cultural practices worldwide, and much older certainly than the relatively recent advent of the so-called exhibitionary complex. And so building upon, but also departing from Baba's characterization of processional epics, I'd like to argue that the heterochronotopic mode as an always already othered time-space continuum doubles down on temporal and spatial experiences and inscribes within each new step all the many steps that have preceded it, in an accretion of time and a repetition of space unique to the cyclical celebrations typical of the Caribbean calendar, from Carnival to Junkanoo to Crop Over, and the occasional commemorations such as the Second Lines of New Orleans. This understanding of the heterochronotopic dimension of African diasporic spatial practices is indebted to Joseph Roach's characterization of the oceanic culture of circumatlantic performance. As an act of surrogation to ensure social continuity and cultural preservation. In Cities of the Dead, Circumatlantic Performance from 1996, I think one of the earliest attempt at theorizing a performance in a Black Atlantic frame, Roach writes that peoples of the Caribbean Rim are at the heart of an oceanic interculture embodied through performance. But he also reminds us that the idea of circumatlantic cultural exchange does not deny Eurocolonial initiatives their place in history, but it regards the result of those initiatives as the insufficiently acknowledged co-creation of an oceanic interculture. An assessment that is very much in keeping with African diaspora art historians' assertion that African diaspora art history belongs fully in Western art history and is neither a subset or a counter to it. Likewise, my phenomenological, always already, combination of Foucault's heterotopia and Bakhtin's chronotope recognizes the dual influences of two archetypal spaces of exception, the museum as heterotopia and the carnival as chronotope. However, in actualizing both concepts into their combined parts, it produces, or it hopes to produce, a third space greater than the sum of each of these two spaces. Indeed, an epistemological shift is afoot within the Black Atlantic world between Western European versus African American spatial legacies of artistic display, a shift that is best exemplified in the passage from the medieval wandering artwork to the American word work. Now, I know time is up. If you can give me 2 more seconds, I will summarize some of the notions that I exposed to you previously. But this is key to me, to shift from the wandering artwork to the road work. What is this wandering artwork to which I refer? For those of you who recently reread, as I have, Tony Bennett's well-known Birth of the Museum, you may recall, I think, one of his central essays, which is, well, the exhibitionary complex. Well, it turned into a chapter in the book, but it was also a separate essay, in which he rebukes Douglas Crim's assertion according to which the museum would be a space of confinement. Indeed, Tony Bennett says, well, if indeed the museum was a space of confinement, it would seem to suggest that previously works of art had been wandering through the streets like the Chiput fools in Foucault's Manette and Civilization, to which I respond, yes, indeed, they had. Not only had works of art been wandering through the streets of medieval Europe, but certainly after 1492 on other ships of containment of bodies to be enslaved, the oceanic interculture that was born of the Middle Passage throughout Latin America, certainly in the Caribbean, gave way to a culture, the visual vocabulary of which was very much cited within the bodies of its performers. And so this is to begin in a way where Tony Bennett doesn't really stop, but doesn't really even considers an alternative, but also to go back to and to conclude on Caribbean theories of space, and to shift to this notion of great import to me of the roadwork, as it was theorized by Christopher Cozier, him again, to speak specifically about the work of Peter Minshall. And here you can see in one of Peter Minshall's landmark work, River from the early 80s, a canopy. Again, the kinds of, spatial trope that, can be used and reused as a ways of framing space, but also giving direction to. And so I will conclude here by saying that in following the locally specific term of roadwork, which again Minshall coined specifically to refer to the work of Minshall, he simply said, so many of the artworks we produce take place in the streets, but of course on the road, which yet has a different meaning and as a diasporic purchase, that I decided to call these works roadworks. And so, so roadworks in a way are to wandering artworks what Mass is to a carnival understood from a European standpoint. It is a redirection and a reassignment of the spatial coordinates of African diasporic performance practices on their own terms, literally, metaphorically, and actually speaking. And so to finish by quoting the potent words of Christopher Cozier, he said that when works such as these ones, and just as a final slide, of Trinidadian massman Peter Minshall passed through the streets of Port of Spain, it became clear that objects and actions could function with equal agency in the social and cultural space, and that the arena for creative expression was inherently much wider. And he concludes, and so do I, apart from those who made work that fitted into the expedient justifications of a local art market, why had artists chosen, and I would say why have curators, chosen or allowed their work to be aligned to such a narrow path? Thank you.